How's it going, guys? My name is Sekani Salman. I'm a designer animator at Imaginary Forces. I'm pretty excited for this presentation today. I have some cool stuff on production techniques, C4D workflow stuff that I want to show you guys. And I also want to have a big shout out to Maxwell for bringing me out. But before I jump into my presentation, I would just love to show you guys some of the work that we do at Imaginary Forces. All right. So today we're going to be talking about C4D production workflow techniques. And this is more or less looking at how you could bring stuff from another software package, say Maya, for instance, bring it into C4D and you gather all your elements there using Cinema 4D as a hub and then carry everything over to After Effects or another compositing software like Nuke, for instance. So we're going to be looking at this one project in particular that I had the chance to work on last year with my buddy Jason Diaz. It's called Fates Forever. This was a really fun one to work on, you know. It comprised of 3 software packages: Maya, Cinema 4D, and After Effects. So I'll give you a little bit of background history about the project. So this game company called Hammer and Chiseled, they were creating this game cinematic for the new game called Fates Forever. But unfortunately, they didn't know how to finish the pipeline. They didn't know how to do really nice lighting and rendering. They didn't know how to do compositing and really give it that sense of polish. But they had really awesome character animation, really awesome environments, but they just needed someone to finish the pipeline. So at that point, that's when they contacted me and asked us to join the team, me and my buddy Jason Diaz, to finish off this process. So we had 6 characters, and we delivered each one in phases. Each phase having 2 characters composited and relit, re-rendered, and 2 transitions. So this was more or less the workflow. They would deliver us files in Maya, which we would then bring into Cinema 4D, render out, and then bring into After Effects. So before we go any further, I'm just going to show some of the initial files that we got from them. You know, they had really cool looking character designs, you know, stuff that was like, wow, this is something I would really, you know, love to work on because the initial concept just looked so awesome. So these were the characters and the environments that they had mocked up. And if I could navigate to Finder, this was as far as they could have gotten it in terms of rendering and lighting and polish because, you know, they didn't know that part of the pipeline. So once again, you know, that's where we come in. But we're not Maya guys, we're C4D guys, you know, and we needed a way to get our stuff from one software package to the next. And this is where C4D really shined. Also, another thing that they requested was to have these page transitions built in. So also incorporating some design using Cinema 4D. Okay, so I'm going to just start by the first part of the workflow, which is bringing stuff from Maya into Cinema 4D. So from Maya, what I ended up doing was exporting an FBX, and I was actually pretty shocked at how much information came over in this FBX. So I'm going to load the exact FBX that I exported from Maya, and now I'm going to bring it into C4D. So at first, everything's going to appear black because all the textures are disconnected. And C4D has this really awesome tool to reconnect all of your textures. I can just hit select all, relink textures, and navigate to the folder that has all my textures. And boom, they're all reconnected. And it was pretty awesome to see that once I brought over the scene from Maya, everything was still intact. The joints, the animation, the background, the cards, everything was still there. And I was like, wow, I was pretty blown away at how easy that pipeline was to bring stuff from Maya to Cinema 4D. So when we got to this point, that's when we began doing some look development. If I just navigate to style frames. So these were the initial look style frames that I had created. This is using Vray for Cinema 4D. This is just taking what they had, re-rendering it, retouching up the textures, specular maps, reflections, that kind of thing, adding some post layers on it. You know, really just trying to nail down a look. This was also one of the looks for the transitions at the time, which changed over time. So, you know, once we got to that point, we divided the labor. My buddy Jason Diaz, he would take care of most of the 3D stuff in regards to switching out the backgrounds, adding new geometry, really polishing that section, and I took care of more of the 3D transitions, page flips, opens, outros, that kind of thing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to open the final version of this file with our character Cottontail that we ended up rendering with Vray. So yeah, this was the scene that we ended up doing our final render. You know, we just really stretched out the background. There's a bunch of little tweaks that we made. We reanimated the camera to make everything feel more dynamic. Yeah, you know, it was a really fun process taking something that someone else did and adding some extra polish. So let's actually take a look at this Volender scene. And this is a pretty cool one. My buddy Jason Diaz, he worked on this. And, you know, to really bring this thing to life, he had just the ground deforming as these guys would be walking through. And again, you know, everything's coming through from Maya with the joints, the animation, everything's still intact. If I jump to this feed cam, we could see how this is being done. And, you know, it's being done really simply, actually. So what's going on is that he's using a collider deformer. If I just jump into these objects, so there's a deformer that's being attached to the snow stage, and we're using the actual character as a deformer. So when he's walking through, it's creating compressions and compressing that floor just using this Deformer. If you go into this Colliders tab, we see both characters as the collider, which is then pushing down the snow when they interact with it. And once again, making for really dynamic animation that brings this thing to life. And we also went in and we switched out all the cards that they had with actual geometry. Really bringing this thing to life. And even just looking how they built the scene, it's another good hint about building scenes. You only really need what you're seeing. Like if you look at the camera, since they kind of plan the camera moves, it's really trickery. Because you're only really seeing, you're only building what you're seeing and nothing more. Okay, so that was a 3D part of the pipeline. Let's jump into the compositing aspect of it. Back, compositing. So when I work on these types of projects, I love to work with render passes. I probably use maybe, depending on which scene, 10 to 15 render passes. They could vary. And you have your main render passes, such as your diffuse, your global illumination, reflection, specular, atmospheric, depth of field, and then all the turbulence FD sims that we did to make all these effects. I'm just going to scroll through so you can have a closer look at these render passes. And since we're using Vray, Vray does their render passes differently from the native Cinema 4D. So then I had to figure out a system to put these things together to actually rebuild my beauty pass. And when I'm doing this type of production where I have multiple scenes that are very similar to work on, it's very important that you figure out, number one, what your layers are going to be and be consistent with them across the board. So then you can kind of build an After Effects template to construct your composite files. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you guys now. So this isn't the build file for this shot, but it is my toolkit. So before I start any shots, this is the main toolkit that I developed where I could just drag in my passes and replace it in these comps. So, I have my diffuse layer, then I have my GI layer, which I multiply on top, my shadow, and I just build it up that way. And if I have a new character that I need to composite, I just bring in my passes in here, my passes folder, and I jump into the diffuse and I just switch out that pass. And as I keep switching out and switching out and switching out, I'm building my base that I can then start building upon. And I usually do my compositing in about 3 different comps. And I have like one comp that I would do all my main stuff, like build the image, add the background, 3D data, all that kinds of stuff. Then I would have another comp where I'm just doing more adjustments. I'm tweaking the color, I'm adding motion blur, I'm adding depth of field, those sexy layers. And then I have my final render where I do some additional color adjustments, nothing too much, just adding that extra spit shine, that extra sexy to make sure the thing looks really polished. So let me actually jump in to a build of a comp I did. So I usually start off with, this is your base diffuse pass that we have, and we're just going to start building, adding your global illumination, then your specular, some reflections, getting our background in, and getting some of the effect stuff in. More lighting, more dynamic lighting from the orb itself. And it's really about paying attention to some of these details. For example, for this scene in particular, I used a standard renderer, and I created a light in this guy and just made sure everything else was like a black color. I just created a pass where I could have a dynamic light emanating from this guy, and I just comp that on as a separate layer. So it's just thinking like that in regards to compositing. And as you can see, this is some of that dynamic lighting I was talking about. Adding vignettes, adding depth of field. We have these little particles around the scene. I sharpen it up a little bit. More color adjustments, chromatic aberration, super important. I use it all the time. Motion blur, and then we have our final image. And if I play back the final of this scene, you know, like originally this is like our main beauty pass, but when the light emanates, that's when I bring that dynamic lighting layer in. So, you know, it seems like the light's reacting as this orb is flying around. So yeah, so that's more or less my toolkit. When it comes to compositing, I'm also doing RGB mats, and it's also cool because you can mix and match stuff with your beauty pass, which I do all the time. So say, for example, you know, I would just use the beauty pass of our character Cottontail here, and I would cut her out using this RGB mat. But you know, this looks a little bit too contrast. Maybe I wanted to feel a little bit more flat with some cartoonish accents to it. So that's when you could just jump in and grab the diffuse pass and just mix it in with your beauty. And that's like the power of compositing, you know, it gives you more options to single out specific attributes in your scene and, you know, give it the shine and the polish that you want and get really specific with it. So another aspect of this project was the transitions. And that took a little bit of figuring out. You know, once again, if I jump back to our main final render, you know, we have all this book stuff, these environments, all these book animations, which were also done with a combination of Cinema 4D and After Effects. I'm opening everything up, wow. So let's actually take a look at that first scene. So what's going on here, more or less? I animated one page that's just turning with a deformer. So I animated the rotation parameter, and it just has a bend deformer going through each page. That's bending it as it's coming around, and I just duplicated that page and offset it in the timeline. So it's doing the same animation, but you know, you have that flipping sensation because it's all offset. And for the background, they provided us with this really awesome matte painting, but you know, it was just a flat. So, and a really nice way of just expanding on something that's flat is just by doing a projection, which is more or less setting up a camera and projecting a texture from that camera onto geometry. So then that image feels like it has more depth. You know, so there's a little bit of parallax, and when you comp everything together, you know, you don't see any of these lines or anything like that. I know this is, once again, how I think to do my things. I just build things in layers. I also did like a volumetric lighting pass and just put everything back together in After Effects. Final render for that was this, when everything got put together. I have a really strong volumetric light, which I also built in another layer that I put together. And I also used that same background. I actually built it specifically for this scene, but I ended up reusing it in the beginning animation. So yeah, you know, that's another way of just expanding your background using just a flat image, you know, instead of going out and building that entire thing. So let's actually talk about the transitions themselves and, you know, how I actually planned doing this. So what we did in Cinema 4D specifically was just the page animation. And what I would do, I would have my image like here, as in how it would be full frame with my character lined up, and then I would animate my camera how I want it to be composed in After Effects. And you know, it's a similar concept for here. But what I actually ended up doing most of the time, I would do one character in one of these files. And then I would, what I mean by this, say for example, we have Lychee here, I would just do him in this specific file, and then for my other character, I would do him on this side, and I would just render the two and combine them in After Effects. So for this file, I just did lychee. So at this point, when I know, okay, the pages are flipped, this is where I kind of wanted to compose him in the scene, and then I just animate my camera to bring this into full screen. So now I have an idea of how I want things to be composed. So then I could just jump into After Effects. And this is where the workflow between Cinema 4D and After Effects really comes in handy, because all I need to render from Cinema is that page flip animation. Let me just jump to that. So this is all I rendered from Cinema, just this page animation. And everything else is built up in After Effects. So it was just more or less blank slates. And with Cinema, you could export all that camera data, all that tracking data, so you could just match 2D elements with your 3D, so it looks like it's been a texture that's been placed in 3D. And it's a more flexible way of working, especially because you can animate stuff in Z-space and just animate stuff in general using After Effects. So if I turn on these layers here, you can see that I have these trackers that move with my page animations. So then all I have to do is just parent my elements that I animated to these nulls, and so then I have my animation moving with my 2D elements. And you know, that's a really important way to think about it like that. Like, how much can I get away with in After Effects versus Cinema 4D? Because After Effects is a little bit more forgiving when it comes to things like that. And you know, this is more or less the same methodology that I used. So for example, I would just do this separately, and like in between here, I would do a cut to the other one, but it's going by so fast, so you don't even know. And yeah, cut to this one. So that's more or less Cinema 4D workflow. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about something else called motion clips that literally saved my life on a project. And I want to talk about this specific spot in particular. Let me find it. Okay. So it was this Listerine. Just want to scroll to it. So it was this Listerine spot that I worked on. Believe it or not, this is probably the most difficult thing I have ever animated. Reason being, this floss is hand animated, so all the bends, all the curves, these were all done with keyframes. And then the client, they wanted to have certain hits. So, okay, we need to get a pack shot at this point, we need to get a floor shot at this point, you need to flip, and you need to do this in the space of 5 seconds. And then they had a lot of retiming requests. That's something I had to do in 3D. Now, when I load up the file, you're going to see that there are like a gazillion keyframes to this thing. I'm going to open up the animation, and I'm going to open up the rig. So this is the animation.
Also try Listerine floss.
And let me just turn off the audio real quick. So that's the animation. If we look at the keyframes, you know, it's really chunky. And for anyone who's retimed things using keyframes, you would know how difficult it is to go in and, okay, I'm going to move this, I'm going to move that. You know, that's nuts. But before I talk about how I retimed it, I just want to show you guys this little rig that I created. Standard. Okay, so this is this Listerine rig that I created, and using simple deformers to actually build it, and a little bit of espresso to create like these custom sliders. And because I'm animating, I like to make these little custom tools. So say, for example, I had a little slider for the cap. I had a slider where I could just increase the height so I could do some squatching and stretching. I could twist it. I can make it bend back and forth. I can make it bulge. And there's a bunch of little things you could do by just building up and using just a bunch of little deformers. And then you just bring everything all together using Espresso. So I've done a tutorial about this in my last NAB presentation in case you guys want to get more in depth with it. But more or less what you do, you create new user data fields. So if I click on my Floss Rig, I created new user data fields where you could define, say, for example, I could add a new user data field. I could call this flipper, for instance, and then I get a new field here. And then if I go into my Espresso, you'll have the option to input one of these fields. So this new field that I created, you could input it here and then attach that field to like another deformer or like another parameter from another deformer. And that could be like your custom slider. So, I mean, that's just simple rigging for you. But what we want to talk about is how would you go and retime something like this without jumping into keyframes? And the answer is motion system. So you see this tag, this is our motion system tag, and I'm just going to take this off, and now when I press play, nothing's retimed, everything's just going as one fluid animation. So let's actually retime this again. I'm going to delete this tag. I'm going to go into my animation window, go to my motion system tab here, and just delete everything so we start fresh. Cool. Jump back into standard. All right, so the first thing we want to do, we want to go to animate, add motion clip. And you want to make sure, and definitely make sure, to uncheck this remove included animation, because what that's going to do is delete all your keyframes on your animation if you leave it checked. So you want to uncheck this for sure. Once that's unchecked, you're going to get this little tag. And then if we jump into animation and you go on this motion systems menu, you're going to see a timeline. So then it's just like animating in an editing software. So say, for example, I wanted to slow down right here for a bit. I could come in, I could cut this. Okay, this is nice and cool from this section. Then I wanted to come here. I'm going to cut this here, move a little bit further in the timeline, and I want to cut here. Then I wanted to ramp up from that point to that point. I could cut that here. Okay, so let's mess around with this a little bit. And it's just like editing. I could squash the end, then I could extend this section that I want to slow down. Move these over to the side, and I could speed up the opening and extend all the parts that I want to slow down. So I could jump back into my standard window, hit play, slows down, and it ramps up. So like, 2 minutes, you've retimed your animation. No keyframes needed don't need to worry about any keyframes. So there's one problem with this. I'm going to demonstrate it using a cube because it's just easier to show. I'm going to build this really quickly. All right, we have a cube. I'm going to have this cube animating from left to right. Okay, cool. Really simple animation here. I'm going to build a new motion systems tag. Add motion clip, make sure this is unchecked, hit OK. Jump back into our animation panel. Motion systems in the middle. I'm just going to cut 1, 1, 2. Uncheck that. And stretch the middle portion out. So now it slows down, it ramps up. But say we want to change this animation, right? Say we want to change this. I'm going to create a new null just to move our motion tag. And now instead, I'm going to have this going across. Then it's going to go up. Then it's going to go up again. And it's going to go down. So that's our new animation. But when I apply my motion tags, what happens is it keeps the animation of the old one. But we don't want that. We want the new animation. And this is one thing you have to understand about motion systems is every time you make this tag, two things happen. One, it creates a motion source. And a motion source is where Cinema 4D keeps all your animation. And then the tag specifically represents this timeline, all these clips on the timeline. So if I delete this tag, you see all the clips disappear, but my motion source still exists. So in order to change the animation, I'm going to have to create a new motion source. So I'm going to drag this motion tag up here. I'm going to select my cube again, hit animate, add motion clip. When I do this, I have a new motion source. I'm going to call this 2. I'm going to call this 1. I have a new motion source and a new clip. But we don't want this new clip. We want our old clips, so we could just delete the new tag that we created right here and then drag our old tag. I'm going to select all these clips, and you can see that it's reading our first motion source. So now if I drag the second one in, and I hit play, it's going to retime on new animation. So this shows the flexibility of the system to still retime something, then go back, change the animation, and still keep the retiming that you already did, which is huge when it comes down to retiming something that has a gazillion keyframes. I'm also going to show another project that I used it in. Go back, back. So this is a fun little project called Kendama Warrior. And as you can see, there's a crap ton of retiming going on there. Just to give you a little bit of background history on this, it's based on a Japanese toy called a kendama, which has a ken and a ball. And the objective is to hit the ball on all 4 sides of this toy. So for this project, which is just a fun side project I was doing in my spare time, I just wanted to do it in the most ridiculous way possible. So that was the objective. But, you know, I use that motion systems tag in various places, like right here when things are retiming. I use it extensively in places like this, where you'll have an animation, and then you would retime it, you would speed it up, and it gave me that flexibility to do that kind of work. So really, really flexible system. Okay, I still have some time left. What goodies can I show you guys? Maybe you could just jump into some of the C4D files. For this one, specifically for this, and this just has the ball animations. But yeah, still a handful of keyframes that we don't want to touch. But you could see, because we have these lines and this motion tag, you could tell that things are also being retimed. If I jump into my animation window, and you can see my timeline where things have been retimed essentially. Okay, I've come to the end of my presentation. I will just end it off by showing my very rough demo reel that is still work in progress. So it's going to be a lot of black in the beginning. Forgive me. But if you want to get a sense of more of the personal work and stuff that I've worked on, that's what you'll get from this.
Let them shoot us flow. 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 Let them go.
That's a wrap. If you want to find out anything more about me, check SekaniMotionDesign.com, and thank you guys so much.